Hi, welcome everyone. My name is Gina Philibert-Ortega, and I am going to be presenting on Cooking Up Votes, Suffrage Era Recipes. I'm so excited to be here. I love food history. This is a great conference. I'm so excited. And, it's a wonderful time to be talking about this topic of suffrage and food history because we are in the year 2020 and it's the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment. And so it's very appropriate. But I understand if you might be scratching your head and saying suffrage and food history, what do those two topics have to do with each other? I totally understand that. Well, actually, a lot. There's a lot of food history that goes with the suffrage movement. And it's a huge topic. For example, we think about the English suffragists and the American suffragists and them being imprisoned for marching and demonstrating. And while they're in prison, they're force-fed, horribly force-fed. So that's a piece of suffrage food history, obviously a very negative one. But then we think about throughout the United States, suffrage restaurants popping up where women fed men and others good food, but also, gave them information about why women should have the right to vote. So that's part of suffrage food history. Suffragists were concerned about all kinds of issues dealing with food. And that makes sense. They were feeding their families, right? But they were also concerned about things like pure food laws. And they were concerned about things like diet and health and nutrition. And we see that when we look at these cookbooks and we look at these recipes, and they include recipes that are vegetarian, that they're following things like health reformers such as Sylvester Graham and his ideas on vegetarianism and, of course, bread. And so they were interested in all of that, and that's what their recipes reflect. Now, suffrage recipes can be found in various publications, including community cookbooks, and three of the most popular I'm showing on my screen right now. But they're also found in things like suffrage newspapers, city and regional newspapers, but that's not the only place where recipes are a focus for suffragists. Suffragists traded recipes in recipe exchanges. They held cooking contests. And at least in one instance of a march, a suffrage march, where one of the women brought suffrage bread to kind of, for a snack in case her fellow marchers needed some sustenance. These recipes were used to influence people. Food and cookbook mentions in suffrage newspapers focused on information such as advertising fundraising cookbooks and providing information about safe food. Local newspapers capitalized on the novelty that suffragists could actually cook. Recipes in these newspapers served as a marketing tool to almost humanize suffragists and show their cooking skills. Now, suffrage cookbooks and suffrage recipes in newspapers served as a way for those suffragists to show that they could cook and they did deserve the right to vote. Anti-suffrage propaganda of the time include caricatures of snaggle-toothed, ugly old spinster women whose looks, just by their depictions, silently explained why they wanted the vote and why they lacked a husband and family. Other depictions stressed that women were expected to not focus on concerns outside of the home, lest their husbands be forced to take on women's work. Now, obviously, far from the truth, cookbooks were a way that women could raise funds just as they had been since the American Civil War. They used community fundraising cookbooks to do this. And they also provided some positive propaganda that showed that these women knew how to cook, and ultimately they were your mothers, your wives, your sisters, and your daughters. The inclusion of men in these cookbooks helped, and their recipes, helped bolster their argument and showed that men in important positions, as well as men who were well known, like author Jack London, his appearance in the Equal Franchise Federation of Western Pennsylvania's Suffrage Cookbook, supported the right for women to vote. This idea that women who want equal rights or who can't cook continues past the 19th Amendment. 1955's Community Cookbook by the Women's Press Club, which is now just the National Press Club, is entitled Who Says We Can't Cook? And it uses this idea that women who are successful or interested in things outside of the home can't cook, but then shows through those recipes that they indeed can, and that career-minded women can multitask and they can cook. Now, all types of suffrage recipes can be found as we look through cookbooks and newspapers and other publications. And they encompass everything from family favorites and food that is from that era to recipes for specific diets to time-saving recipes, which makes sense because these were women who were busy and they needed to multitask. And so they incorporate things like canned food and technologies. So as you can see, this discussion is much more broader than we'll have time for today. Now, what I want to specifically point out as I go through some of these suffrage recipes is some themes that come out time and time again. And not all the themes, like I said, some of them have to do with time saving, and we're not going to have time for that today. That's ironic. So we're going to look at specifically color and color in recipes. You know, the American suffrage movement's colors were yellow, purple, and white. And so some of the recipes we see are yellow, for example. Eggs are a good example. And that is directly meant to invoke this idea of suffrage. Some of the recipes use words or language that invokes suffrage and enfranchisement and progressive. And that's another tool that suffragists use as they were naming their recipes. So, for example, I mentioned suffrage bread earlier, but there's also suffrage cake, suffrage eggs. I'm sure there's others as well. And a lot of times, like suffrage cake was a cake recipe that is used in other formats, and it's called different things. But using the word suffrage helps to, tie it to the movement. Now, there's also faux recipes, and these are some of my favorite. These are recipes that are not necessarily for food, right? And you might be familiar with these. These are something that we still see in community cookbooks today. They tend to be recipes for how to have a happy husband or how to grow happy children, that kind of thing. And so they don't give us food in the recipe. They actually give us some kind of wisdom. So we see that in suffrage cookbooks as well. All right, so let's start with a suffrage newspaper. Now, this suffrage newspaper is the longest running suffrage newspaper, the Women's Tribune. It was published outside of Beatrice, Nebraska. It was the work of Clara Colby, and she launches it in 1883. It was a newspaper that was well regarded among the suffrage movement. Suffrage leaders read it. At one point, it basically was seen as one of the tools of the National Women's Suffrage Association. You know, people like Susan B. Anthony read it, and so forth. Now, although it didn't really have a recipe column, it did talk about food in various ways. One way was by talking about various cookbooks that supported the cause. So this is just one example I'm going to show you, and this is from 1891. It's basically a review or an advertisement for this cookbook, and I'm going to probably slaughter this name, but it's the Wimodoxis cookbook. And although not a suffrage organization, it was a women's organization. That word, that made up word that I can't pronounce, is basically short for wives, mothers, daughters, and sisters. And so it tells you about the cookbook. It also tells you, if you kind of scroll down and look towards a little bit lower than the middle, that it includes a recipe by Susan B. Anthony, and then it continues on and tells you how you can purchase this. So food and reviews, cookbooks, they did appear in suffrage magazines and other periodicals. Now, here's an example that's from the Sunday Telegram from Clarksburg, West Virginia. And so this is a regular city newspaper. This is from 1915. So, we still have 5 years before the 19th Amendment. And I'm just showing you at first the whole newspaper so you get the context. But you can see at the very top it says, "Feed men suffrage with their meals. Mrs. Scott's idea." So this is written by a Mrs. Scott. And it's that whole idea that a way to a man is through his stomach kind of idea. So it's obvious that they are talking about these recipes, trying to influence men and showing men that they could do other things and they could also vote. So here's a little bit of a close-up, and just to kind of show you, the second and third column have all kinds of recipes. So let me focus on one in particular. This is for progressive eggs. Much of the recipes in this article have eggs in them, so there's that yellow color. Even the progressive salad, which was on the third column, has yellow. And so progressive eggs have hard-boiled eggs, obviously the yellow of the yolks, and it talks a little bit more about that recipe. Progressive is probably a way to say, hey, be progressive, let women have the vote. Now, the article ends, it's a pretty lengthy article, but it ends with this idea. Generally, there are men in the party, so, your family or your get-together. Be sure that you draw their attention to the fact that it is a suffrage meal. And we see that because it has yellow color, it has words like progressive, so it's obvious it's a suffrage meal. They say that the way to a man's heart is through his stomach. Why should not the way to a man's vote be through his stomach? So that's pretty clear about what they were doing with getting involved with going to newspapers and publishing recipes and publishing community cookbooks and that kind of thing. Here's another example I wanted to show you. Now, this is from 1911, so it's a little, the one I just showed you was 1915. This is 1911, and it's from the Evening World. And I'm showing you the whole first page just to give you that context again. But it is titled, "Can a Suffragette Boil Eggs?" She can, and Club proves it. And so we even get an image of a suffragette. So this talks about politics and cooking and suffrage and food. But when we kind of scroll down some more, it talks about this idea of yellow recipes and using a color scheme to prove your point. And so that's part of it. Now, what's funny is when you get to that second column and you can kind of see up above this ad, there's 2 suffrage recipes that look good, which I always think is kind of funny. But it gives you 2 suffrage recipes. They both have suffrage in the title. There's suffrage cookies, which I would imagine, because they have orange, and they're a light colored cookie, most likely sort of yellow. And then there's a suffrage salad, which to us in modern times doesn't sound like a salad and probably doesn't sound real appealing. It's fish, and after you remove the bones, you sprinkle it with some lemon juice. You add some chopped celery, mix with mayonnaise dressing, and you garnish it with olives and sliced beets. So we don't have that yellow, but we probably have sort of purplish from the beets. So those are two recipes that they're putting forward, and they're renaming as suffrage to kind of get their point across. Now, there's other articles in newspapers as well, and this is just a standard city or a county newspaper from Iowa, and it is from 1916, so still before 1920. And it shows a suffragist, Mrs. Pleasant J. Mills of Des Moines, and it talks about this suffrage cake. And it shows her making it. And it shows a good example of that they were raising funds not just by selling cookbooks and having different events, but also just selling individual recipes. In this one, it says this new delicacy, which is in the fruit cake order, promises to become widely known as suffrage cake. And I think it's important that I don't know about this specific recipe, but the term suffrage cake could mean all kinds of different cakes. It wasn't just one standard recipe. And it says it is highly recommended because of its delicious economical features. The suffrage cake will play an important part in the suffrage campaign, as Mrs. Mills is sharing the secret with other Iowa suffragists for a small sum of 10 cents. So great is the demand for knowledge concerning this marvelous cake that at a recent social function, $8 was added to the suffrage treasury through the sale of the suffrage cake recipe. So they're not just providing recipes in newspapers or providing them in these community cookbooks, but they're also selling individual recipes as well. Now, remember I talked about suffrage bread, and I think suffrage bread probably is also one of those generics and could be lots of different kinds of bread recipes, and this is a good example. This doesn't give you the recipe, but it talks about this suffragist who is going to this fair, a Grange fair, and she's the president of the Harbor Springs Equal Suffrage Association, and she's a busy mom. And so it's her baking day, so she makes her bread, she grabs her kids, she runs down to the fair, she sets up the suffrage booth, and she goes ahead and takes that bread and enters it into a contest. She names it Suffrage Bread, and she takes first prize. So I'll tell you, this article appeared in newspapers across the United States, and it was for a Michigan woman. But it appeared all over, and I think kind of that same message of, look, suffragists are complex people. They're not just this one-sided anti-suffrage, dimension that we often see in some of that anti-suffrage propaganda. Now, another thing that newspapers did is they also not only published recipes from suffragists, but they also published articles that had to do with the cookbooks the suffragists were publishing. And in my own experience, reading about suffrage cookbooks, we only know about maybe a handful. I showed the 3 most popular. There's a few others as well. And then there's others that are rarely noted, but that I find when I research in newspapers, and it could be that there aren't extant copies. Now, this is one that a lot of people are familiar with. It's readily available online to look at, the Washington Women's Cookbook. And this newspaper article about this cookbook talks about that a favorite argument of the anti-suffragists, is that suffrage is likely to masculinize women, and that they are not domestic loving creatures. And so they say, look, here's a cookbook they put together. And this cookbook is actually fairly hefty. There's 700 recipes. There's information about what to take on a mountaineering expedition. There's all kinds of information in it. But what's important is It has all kinds of recipes. It's this publication they use to fund the suffrage movement, and this article gives you a little bit of an idea about what's going on during this time period. Now, that cookbook, like I mentioned, has a lot of really interesting recipes and also just content, period. And this is an example from that cookbook. This is German cooking, a whole section on German cooking. And, so although some of these cookbooks have recipes that are specific to the suffrage movement, that are named for suffrage, that are yellow, all of that, they also have recipes that reflect their communities, that reflect the women in the community and other interests of the people in that community, just like all community cookbooks. Now, here's the other one that is fairly well known, and this is the Suffrage Cookbook, Mrs. L.O. Kleber. I mentioned it actually before. I showed that Jack London recipe. He actually has a few recipes in that. It's by the Equal Franchise Federation of Western Pennsylvania. It has this great blue cover with Uncle Sam, and he's got the scales with a man and a woman, and then he's got that wheel with the different spokes showing the different places that allow suffrage in various forms, since some women had full suffrage at this point, but some women had maybe suffrage for school elections, for example. So here's another example of using the word suffrage, and it's another suffrage cake, right? It's Suffrage Angel Cake a la Kennedy, because Miss Eliza Kennedy is providing it, and it's got 11 eggs. So, and it also gives you a kind of a plug for this flour, Swan's down flour. So that's another example of one of these suffrage recipes, and showing you that they really weren't all the same, that it was more of a generic title. Now, remember I mentioned those faux recipes? This is a great one from this cookbook. It's Pie for a Suffragist's Doubting Husband. And so I love this. It has the milk of human kindness, which we could all use, right? And then it has talking points for the suffrage movement. And these are talking points that suffragists used when they talked about why women should have the right to vote. And it covers some of the concerns they had in the world. Now, the instructions are really interesting. It says, mix the crust with tact and velvet gloves, using no sarcasm, especially with the upper crust. So basically, it's trying to tell you that as you're trying to convince your husband, you need to do so in a manner that doesn't upset him, especially if he's from the upper crust. And then it says, upper crusts must be handled with extreme care, for they quickly sour if manipulated roughly. I think it's important to also remember, and unfortunately we don't have time to go into the diversity of the suffrage movement, and obviously I'm focusing on the American suffrage movement. You know, we often, when we look at the suffrage movement, look at white, middle class to upper class women who were involved and who had some wealth. That isn't the whole story of the suffrage movement, and I really want to acknowledge that. And so some of this, especially this recipe, points to kind of what the suffrage movement looked like, but that wasn't the whole suffrage movement. Now here's another example, and this is called Auntie's Favorite Hash. Once again, Auntie's is slang for anti-suffragists, and those could be women or men. It's important to know that women didn't always want the right to vote, and not all women did, and sometimes they were the worst enemy of the suffrage movement. Now, I like the setup of this recipe. If you see at the very top, there's that famous line that we've all heard, tell me what you eat and I'll tell you what you are. I think that's really apropos for this page. And then if we look at the bottom, before, we won't look at the recipe just yet. Look at the bottom, and it has an exchange between a husband and a wife. And it says, husband, angrily, great guns. What are they, lamb chops or pork chops or veal chops? And then the wife says, can you tell by the taste? And he says, no, I can't, nor anybody else. And then she says, well, what's the difference? I think that's a really interesting commentary on thinking about women getting the right to vote. So we have that set up on the page. Now let's look at the recipe. So it starts off with, unless you wear dark glasses, you cannot make a success of Auntie's favorite hash. So it's obvious that this is kind of a put down to anti-suffragists, but I think, like the previous recipe, it's a recipe that's satire and kind of tongue-in-cheek, obviously, but they're trying to make a point. And so the recipe calls for a pound of truth thoroughly mangled, one generous handful of injustice sprinkled over everything in the pan, and then 1 tumbler of acetic acid well shaken. And at the end it says, stir all together with a sharp knife, because some of the tidbits will be tough propositions. So that's another example of some of these faux recipes that you sometimes find, and that you find in this particular suffrage cookbook. Now, the last cookbook I'm going to just show is this one that's also a very well-known one. This is out of Boston. This is the Women's Suffrage, or the Women's Suffrage Cookbook. Hattie Burr is the editor of this cookbook. Like the others, it includes women and men who were suffragists and provided recipes. Now, I wanted to talk about this recipe in particular because although this has really, its origins aren't in the suffrage movement, but it is adapted for the suffrage movement. So I don't know if you know about election cake, but it is a well-known recipe, and election cake stems even back to the Revolutionary War period. People who would have bought this cookbook would have been well familiar with election cake. Elections at one time were almost like holidays, or they were holidays, and women supplied food, including election cake, as well as other refreshments, in a way to encourage men to vote and then to celebrate afterwards. Now, obviously, prior to suffrage and prior to the 19th Amendment, women were providing the refreshments, but they weren't largely, depending on the time period and place, they were not participating in the election. So this, I think, has an important place in this cookbook. It's titled Mother's Election Cake, with that emphasis on women being part of an election. And so it's a really good reminder that women were going from wanting to just, have this place where they're cooking and they're supporting men, to actually being fully involved and using their citizenship. So, 1920, 19th Amendment passes. This idea that women, their places in the kitchen, like I said, continues. 1955, we still see cookbooks referring to that. Women start voting, but not all women, and there's all kinds of reasons. That's a talk in and of itself. So, but this idea of food history and suffrage is a vast topic, and I only, told you a little bit. As we continue our study of the suffrage movement, especially in this year, food history is so important. It tells us something about the women during this time period. It reflects on kind of the fluidity of recipes and how they have an ephemera quality, that they are changed and adapted according to place and time. I also think as further study happens that we need to think about whose voice isn't heard in this discussion. Like I mentioned before, these cookbooks and the suffrage movement that we tend to think about is one of white women who were middle class and above, who were privileged. And we need to consider that as we continue to look at recipes and food history for those suffragists, and learning about other groups, including African American women's suffrage groups, and how food history impacted them and what they were doing as well. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate it, and I hope that gave you something to kind of think about and another way to look at suffrage. Have a great rest of your conference.